Okay, boys and girls, you ready for chapter 21? Okay, I decided to be outside because it's so beautiful today. But here's hoping nobody starts their lawnmower or the jets don't start flying over. So we'll cross our fingers, okay? Abby's keeping guard. You want to see? And there's my Lego cup. The boys give that to me, or James did, for Christmas a couple years ago. She'll watch guard, though. She'll make sure nobody gets us. Right? Okay. Chapter 21. A matter of the utmost importance. Charlotte would not let me purchase a newspaper, even with my very own pocket money. There'd be one waiting at home, she said, and we were late. True enough, Mummy and Granny Jane were entertaining Mr. Standfast in the drawing room when we arrived, and the tea trolley had been rolled in, brimming with Mrs. Corner's best offerings. Tony slept as near to the fire as he could be without singeing. Charlotte did not join the family for meals if there was company, so she excused herself. "Where's the newspaper?" I asked. "And where's Rose?" "The evening edition has not yet come," said Granny Jane. "But the newsboys had it," I said. "Rose will be here," said Mummy. "Alas, a grieving person occasionally loses her senses of time." "There's been an arrest," I said. "The newsboys were hollering like jackdaws. Where's the paper?" "Agatha, dear," said Granny, "your fussing will not speed its arrival. Say hello to our guest." Dutifully, I bade Mr. Standfast a good evening and accepted the cup of tea that Mummy poured for me. I had just dropped in 3 lumps of sugar when there came a frantic hammering on the front door, followed by the scuffle of Sally's running steps. A ruckus in the foyer brought us all to our feet. "Rose at last," said Mummy. "Oh, why such a clamor?" Someone crying, more of Sally's hurried footsteps, and the door to the drawing room burst open. "Oh, please, ma'am, come!" Sally's eyes were wild as if she'd met a leopard in the vestibule. "It's Miss Rose," she said. "Miss Rose Eversham. She's quite undone." Mr. Standfast pushed past the maid and returned half a minute later, supporting a weeping Rose. "Sorry," said Rose, gulping a bit. "It's just that I finally have someone to tell, and I seem to be—" "More tea," Mr. Standfast told Sally. "She needs sweet tea." "Whatever has happened?" said Mummy. "Arrest in mermaid room," is what I thought. But who? "Brandy," said Granny Jane, opening the cupboard that held rows of stemmed glasses and glimmering cordials in dark bottles. Rose was whisked to a chair, Papa's favorite, and handed a sniffer before she could even settle into the cushions. Mr. Standfast urged Rose to drink, but one small sip of brandy made her cough. She couldn't talk for ages, and we had to wait politely to hear her news, though clearly the headline shouted in town and Rose Eversham's miserable disarray must be parts of the same story. Granny Jane was the first to succumb to curiosity. "Well, dearie, what has happened?" "They've taken away Aunt Marianne in the police wagon." Rose paused to collect herself. "They say she murdered my mother." "No! Miss Marianne, they got it all wrong." She just said that in her head, not out loud. We pummeled Rose with questions, but the police had not been forthcoming. How vexing that the newsboys on the Strand, and probably Mr. Augustus Fibley, knew more about Miss Marianne's situation than we did. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Morton," said Mr. Standfast, bowing slightly to Mummy. "And Mrs. Morton?" Another bow to Granny Jane. "I regret that I must leave your hospitable domain, but if Miss Eversham is being detained, I must be present. I will insist on speaking with the prisoner at once." So the lawyer's going to go see if he can take care of this, right? "The prisoner?" whispered Rose. Tony patted back and forth in front of her chair as if in consternation. "Do you suppose your man could drive me into town?" said Mr. Standfast. Mummy and Granny Jane and Granny glanced at each other, both a bit pink. "Our man is the garden boy for the time being," said Granny, capping the brandy bottle with a sharp click, "and the vehicle is a cart. But there is nothing young Mr. Cable likes better than driving like a chariot racer." "Mr. Cable?" said Mr. Standfast. "His name is Leonard," I said. "Granny calls him Mister to make him sound more respectable." "I'll come with you." Rose tried to stand but swayed and sat back down with a bump. "You will not," said Mr. Standfast. "I'm quite certain that Mrs. Morton will serve you soup of some sort, and then you will rest for a while. I shall return to see you, Rose, when I have met with your aunt and know better of her situation." What's important is that Ms. Bouse got her drink of coffee, right? Yes. I'll tell cook that we need broth, Mummy said. Mummy led Mr. Standfast away with the intention of finding Leonard. I pushed the ottoman close to where Rose sat, but did not quite have the courage to take her hand. Granny Jane asked more questions. Despite Rose's disquiet and her hiccupy way of answering, we eventually had a jumbled sense of the afternoon story. They'd had poached pears and cheese for lunch, Rose and her Auntie Em sitting in the kitchen near the fire. It was their habit to seek comfort below stairs rather than to use the grand dining room for just the two of them. Their maid, Nora, had been humming while she washed the crockery and waited for the kettle to boil. I wanted to tell her, "Oh, do skip the humming, maid, and get to the point." But Rose was in shock and not to be hurried. Inspector Locke and 2 young constables had come banging on the kitchen door, Rose reported, and tromped across the stone floor with their muddy boots, making Nora awfully peevish. Auntie Em was to go with them to the police station, the inspector said. Her previous statement was lacking particular details, they said, including the truth. Auntie Em laughed at such nonsense. "She's done nothing wrong," cried Rose, and the inspector said they'd see about that. One of the constables, with dreadful spots, said there was new evidence to implicate her. Auntie Em asked what could there possibly be. The inspector said she would come without a fight or they would have to restrain her. Auntie Em said she'd best speak to her solicitor. The spotty constable sneered to the other. "Well, that's the sign of a guilty conscience." Auntie Em was ever so plucky, according to Rose, though her eyes were too bright and her hair became disheveled. They said to come along. It was only questions for now. Rose helped her on with her coat. She'd paused, brave and tender, to look at Rose, leaving firm but hurried instructions, Rose being blind with tears and deaf with worry. "It's all a mistake," Rose said. "Is it now?" said the inspector. "They've got an eyewitness confirming that Miss Marianne Eversham did not take sugar in her tea, proving that she was not the intended victim. First step toward a death sentence, in his opinion. After that, they bullied her out the door like a common criminal." Granny Jane examined the row on her knitting needle. She had slipped a stitch. "Inspector Locke," she said, "reminds me of Mrs. Winky, the greengrocer's wife. She'd insist on selling you cucumbers because she'd got so many that week, even though you'd come in the shop for cauliflower." She sighed and pulled the wool to release the errant stitch. "What happened next, Rose dear?" Rose sank back into Papa's chair. "That's everything," she said. "Nora wept at the sink while my blood turned as cold as January." As cold as January. Who was it? Grace? Was it you? Sahi? Who was it that on Seesaw told me that in Aggie Morton they kept using similes like you guys just learned about in the poetry Nearpod? As cold as January. Her blood turned as cold as January. Simile, right there. That exactly described the dread that overtook me now, but also the prickling heat of shame. This was a terrible lesson in the curse of vanity. I'd thought myself to be so clever telling Constable Beck about dancers and their aversion to sweets. I'd been so entranced with my own cleverness that it seemed I'd knotted the noose for Miss Marianne. And then, Rose sat up straight, not 5 minutes later, he must have been watching the house and waiting for his chance. There came another knock. A reporter from the Torquay Voice. Tony barked suddenly by the sudden rise in volume. "Mr. Fibley?" Another chill followed the first. Was there something even colder than January? Mr. Fibley had an unnerving ability to appear without any warning, precisely where he wasn't wanted. "He said to call him Gus," said Rose, "and if I'd called him anything beyond an interfering scribbler." "What did he want?" said Granny Jane. "Got as far as mentioning the word sugar when I slammed the door so hard I believe I cracked the glass." "It is nearly 6 o'clock, said Granny Jane. "What have you been doing all afternoon?" Rose's eyes were rimmed with red and looked smudged beneath with ashes. Oh, do you hear Abby barking? The other dog came out and now they're talking, and that's so annoying. If she doesn't stop, I'm going to have to stop the video and make her stop. "I wept like a broken-hearted child. Mother is dead. The police believe that Auntie Em killed her. I'm not sure which is worse. I wandered through the house asking my father's spirit to come and guide me. I really did that. Out loud. Abigail, come here. Abby. Good girl. Come on, up here. You don't need to bark. You need to chill. That's not guarding me and the kids while we have a read aloud. It's just being annoying. Granny Jane leaned over to pat Rose on the hand. And what did he tell you, dear? Rose exhaled a small, sad sound, pretending to be a laugh. He did not answer, of course. He never was much good at having a conversation. I crashed about the house in a rage, pounding cushions and kicking chair legs, behaving, my mother would say, like a savage. That is not surprising, dearie. Granny Jane kept patting Rose's hand. Sorrow does not lie easily on anyone's shoulders, least of all the young, who have not yet learned how to carry such weight. Eventually, said Rose, the fog in my head began to lift. I went over the scene in the kitchen and recalled Auntie Em's last directions, which I should have been acting upon far sooner. Her eyes again filled with tears, but she brushed them fiercely away. She told me in the most urgent voice. She said, Rose broke off and looked directly at me, making my stomach whoosh with trepidation. Did she know that I was to blame for the afternoon's calamity? I had one task to fulfill, Rose cried. I've let my aunt rot all afternoon when she most particularly wanted me to. What did she want you to do? The question rang inside my head. Before Rose could finish her sentence, Mummy came backward into the room. Having pushed the door open with her bottom, she held a steaming mug in one hand and the evening edition of the Torquay in the other. Lamb broth for you, Rose dear. Mrs. Corner's best. She nudged a doily into place on the occasional table by Rose's chair and put the mug down. She drew a rolled serviette from her cardigan pocket and laid it across Rose's lap. How nice to see Mummy as nurse instead of patient. Mr. Standfast has gone off with Leonard in the cart, though it threatens to rain at any moment and he hasn't had his supper. Granny held out a hand to receive the newspaper, but Mummy shook her head. No. Granny Jane raised an eyebrow and Mummy raised an eyebrow back. Did Rose notice? She sipped her lamb broth and said, My eyes were now riveted on the newspaper tucked under Mummy's arm, evidently being kept from Rose. News of Miss Marianne's arrest was festering in those pages, and I ached to know the details. Rose put her mug carefully back on the lace doily. I'd like to freshen up, if I may. I must look frightful. As if Rose Eversham could ever look frightful. I'll show you where. I hopped up, surprising Tony, who sneezed. There's a mahogany seat on our loo. That's the loo is the bathroom. Agatha, really? Mummy scolded. Not a subject to be mentioned in the drawing room. I led Rose along the hall. Just in here, I said. But Rose did not go in. She looked both ways, took my hands in her own, and began to whisper. The weepy-eyed maiden of a few moments before had disappeared. A more familiar Rose, intrepid and determined, was suddenly talking to me as if it were a matter of life and death. I don't want anyone poking their noses in, said Rose, even if your family means well. I'm not trusting anyone. My aunt said that you received something in error and that she needs it right away. It's a matter of the utmost importance to save her from being kept in jail for the rest of her life. Or hanged. Uh-oh. That's the end of the chapter. Is Aggie going to give her the letter? Should Aggie give her the letter? I mean, it's theirs, right? Why should Aggie get to keep it? But what if it's a crucial clue and, like, she shouldn't give it up because maybe Miss Rose or Miss Eversham, maybe it's just all a fake facade and they're not really upset, right? Yeah, I'll read chapter 22. Let's read it, okay? It's called An Alarming Arrest. Hector and I had been right. Miss Marianne had been the one to hide the letter in my notebook. What could you possibly have that matters so much? Said Rose. If you'll give it to me, I'll take it on to her. I found myself shaking my head. I would not pass along the letter to anyone, not even Rose Eversham. Perhaps Rose was only pretending not to know what she was asking for. She had not been ruled out entirely as a conspirator to the murder. Look how she transformed from a mournful damsel into a clear-eyed fighter in a matter of seconds. I feel, I said, as if I'm the guardian of the thing that I have. I'll come with you to the police station. I'll give it to her myself. I suppose, Rose looked uncertain, but we must go at once. She made the announcement as she swung open the drawing room door. "Aggie is coming with me to visit my aunt now before poor Auntie Anne believes that she has been abandoned." Mummy and Granny were on the settee, their heads bent close, reading together from the evening Torquay. Oh, they were quickly trying to read the paper, weren't they? As we came in, they startled and shuffled the newspaper untidily shut. Their expressions were remarkably like those of children with fists full of purloined sugar lumps, which means kids that had stolen some sugar or some candy. Uh-oh, hold on, my pillow's falling. No! Here, I got my book resting on a pillow. Where was I now? Oh, "You have the evening news," said Rose. Mummy and Granny Jane coughed at precisely the same moment. "Come, dearie, sit down," said Granny. "This will be a bit of a shock." I could read the words in bold print from across the room. "Mermaid Room murder. Dancing mistress in custody for heinous crime." "In custody?" said Rose. "Does that mean arrested?" "It does," said Granny Jane. Rose sat with a bump in Papa's chair. "Will you read it to me, please?" She sounded bossy enough that Mummy raised her eyebrows, but nevertheless straightened the pages and cleared her throat. Granny Jane picked up her knitting and began a new row, the needles clicking in accompaniment. "The investigation into the death by poison of Mrs. Irma Eversham Saturday last has reached a possible conclusion with the arrest this afternoon of the victim's spinster sister-in-law, Miss Mary Ann Eversham. She was dragged from the kitchen." "Dragged?" said Rose. "She wasn't dragged, except perhaps in spirit. She walked quite sedately, considering the circumstances." "Yes, dear, you were there. She walked sedately from the kitchen," said Mummy. "Of the Evermore Villa, the home she inherited from her brother, the late Captain Giles Eversham, husband of the victim. The culprit's removal was witnessed by her niece, Miss Rose Eversham, who was too distressed to comment." "I never stopped commenting to the police," said Rose. "But when that sneaking newshound showed up, I refused to say a word." "The gruesome crime scene on Union Street," Mummy continued to read, "was interrupted by the arrival of a number of Miss Mary Ann Eversham's dance students a short time after the victim's brutal demise in the Mermaid Room dance studio. Miss Agatha Caroline Morton, a 12-year-old neighbor of the Eversham Villa on Barton Road, was first on the scene." Shame draped itself around me like a cloak. Every moment was further proof that I should never have spoken to Augustus Fibbley. She described the body in accurate detail, matching the report released by the police. Miss Morton is a familiar of the heir to the victim's fortune, Miss Rose Eversham, 17. As previously reported, Miss Morton attempted to lay blame for the murder elsewhere than on her dance instructress. When interviewed at her home, Miss Morton suggested the police were not following the correct path. Will this be a case where an innocent can see what... Mummy broke off, reading to stare at me. "When were you interviewed in your home? How is it possible that a journalist was permitted to speak to a child without a chaperone?" I flinched. "I'm not a child," I muttered, but it was no defense in the face of 3 pairs of glaring eyes. "Where was Charlotte?" "It was only a moment," I said. "Mr. Fibbley appeared at the garden gate. He was very polite. Leonard spoke to him as well." Here I was bending the truth in another direction. "Naturally, Mr. Fibbley wished to hear the observations of an eyewitness." "Agatha," said Mummy, "this is most incorrect." "I'm sorry, Rose," I said. Mr. Fibbley had made me feel observant and important, but then he'd twisted the words around to suit himself. "Even Tony liked him." I tugged on Tony's silky ears and eventually stopped baying like a wolf. That's not true, remember? Tony would not stop barking. Remember? He was like, "You have to control that little dog." "Don't apologize," said Rose. "You're the only person who has said that you believe Auntie Em to be innocent. And there it is in the Torquay voice. I appreciate your voice." "Do go on," she said to Mummy. "I must leave to see my aunt, but please keep reading while I find my hat." The whole room seemed to sigh with relief after that. I'd done grievous harm to Rose, but here she was, rescuing me once more. This time from the trembling upset I could hear in Mummy's voice as she kept reading. "A case where an innocent can see what is not visible to her elders. Miss Rose Eversham has been romantically linked to Mr. Roderick Fusswell, a son of the Royal Victoria Hotel manager, Mr. Curtis Fusswell." "You weren't wearing a hat," I said. "No hat, no gloves, no handbag. You were too upset to think about such things, I expect." But Rose was staring at Mummy. "What was that?" she said. The bit about Roddy Fusswell?" Granny Jane's needles paused in their clicking as Mummy went on. "Mr. Fusswell identified himself as fiancé to the Fiancé? Said Rose. Conceited pig! I would never. Well, this was good news. If she wouldn't marry him, she would not seek his help in killing her mother. One of those alliances of love that I was learning to understand. Fiancé to the young heiress, and announced his intention of protecting her from further anguish. The victim was an unpleasant old carp, he said. I'm surprised it took so long for someone to top her. She was asking for something like this to happen. Before today's arrest of Miss Marianne Eversham, Mr. Fuswell expressed surprise that her guilt was not obvious to the police. A female without the guidance of a man is not to be trusted. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, Roddy, you are out the window for me, my friend. Let me reread that, and we'll just talk about how bad he is. He said, a female without the guidance of a man is not to be trusted. Well, I think you, Mr. Roddy Fuswell, should not be trusted. He said in an interview, she already owns the house, which is too heavy a responsibility for any woman. I can't help but wonder, what is she after now? If it's Rose's inheritance, she'll have to go through me. What a jerk, right? Good grief. Rose's hands were clamped over her mouth as if she might be sick. Oh, how dare he, she cried. Is there anything more? Good grief, this article is just dumping stuff, isn't it? Mummy carried on. Miss Rose Eversham has not made a statement. No trial date has yet been set, but according to an anonymous source in the constabulary, Miss Rose may be required to testify against her aunt. A series of loud knocks on the front door made us all jump. Heavens, cried Mummy. Has word gone out that we're as deaf as stones at Groveland? I'll answer it. I hurried to the hallway. Oh dear. A man's silhouette shadowed the narrow window next to the front door. Would a killer knock? I thought not, and opened the door. Mr. Roddy Fuswell stood on the step, his hat sitting crookedly and his face shining with damp in the lamplight. I peered around him into the night. Had Hector remained stoically on his quarry's tail, and was he now lurking outside? Outside it was fully dark, slivers of rain flashing in the light cast by our hallway chandelier. I'm looking for Rose Eversham. Roddy Fuswell nudged the door further open, assuming an invitation that I had not made. The maid over there. He tipped his head in the direction of the Evermore villa. Said I might find her here? I tried again to look past him without being too conspicuous. No visible pale face or green eyes. What is Abby chasing? I don't know what she's doing. Hello? Roddy Fuswell rapped his knuckles on the open door. His yellow leather gloves barely softened the sharp raps next to my ear. Tell Rose I want to speak with her, will you? Inside, with more light, Roddy Fuswell looked at me more closely. Oh, he said, it's you. This is where you live. I scowled at him, and he scowled back at me. You've stirred up a cauldron full of trouble today, you and your insufferable grandmother telling lies to that reporter, making me look bad in front of Rose. I was insulted enough that I forgot to be shy. You seem perfectly able to make yourself look bad, Mr. Fuswell, and my grandmother is not. Is Rose here? It's very important. He had removed his coat and held it dripping at arm's length, as if I were going to take it and hang it up. I did not. He grunted softly and tossed it over the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. Where will I find her? He plunked his hat on the hat stand. Did Rose want to be found by a possible murderer? After what he'd said in the newspaper? Wait here, I said. I'll ask whether she cares for a visitor. Mr. Fuswell narrowed his eyes at me. Well, you cheeky little... I turned my back, feeling taller with every step. Before slipping into the drawing room, I saw him pause at the hallway mirror to smooth his caterpillar-like mustache. And that is the end of chapter 22. Do you think Rose is going to ask to see him? You will have to wait to find out. I'm so sorry. Bye.